All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Teri Czinn, for dedicating all of his Sherman Drushos this month in loving memory of Teri's father, Dr. Harry Kahn, Hirsh ben Yosef HaKohen, on the occasion of his 10th yahrzeit. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all of his Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah and grandmother, Dinah Bas Dov. Zechariah Bracha. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Yehudah and Bracha Buchwalter, in commemoration of the Shloshim of Rabbi Yehudah's father, Usher, Zelig ben Yaakov, Yehudah HaLevi. Zechariah Bracha. We hope to have the merit of our Talmud Torah. All of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Beis Leiv 32. So we are picking up at the Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Aleph on the base 31b. A really interesting sugya today. Mishnah ben Nazir ben Nishal l'chacham. So let's listen to this. Someone took on a Neder Nazirus, and then during the Neder Nazirus itself, he asks a chacham to be released from the Neder. Okay, so again, Reuven became a Nazir, and then ultimately again he petitions a Talmud Chacham to be released. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Misha Nazir ben Nazir. It's about 5 lines up from the end of the page. V'niskar sheta ben Naziruso v'hischel is charebo v'halach v'avra al Naziruso v'shasa yayin v'nitma l'mesim v'achar kach halach v'nishlacham l'hatri Naziruso. So we'll say, so Rashi points out over here, by the way, a little bit more to this story. It's not just that he had Nazir remorse, which is very common, right? But rather what happened, he undertook a Nazir Nazirus and he violated it. In other words, so what did he do? He drank wine. Right? He went ahead and he drank wine. Now the truth is, we'll leave out nitma. We'll see why I leave out nitma for just a moment. See, he went ahead and he drank wine. So now we'll say, after drinking the wine, he goes to the Chacham and he petitions the Chacham for release from the Neder. What happened? Va'asu. The Chacham said no. Right? So we'll say, so again, remember, you have to have grounds to be released from the Neder. In this case, the Chacham said, you cannot go ahead and be released. So we'll say, so now, and here's something very interesting happened. Now, there's an important fact that I don't know that we've ever actually articulated in this Masechta, but it's important to do so. In general, right, a Nazir is not permitted to go out and drink wine, right, cut his hair, become Tamil Mason. The only thing that requires him, that would stop his Neder Nazirus and require him to start all over again is Tumah. See, for example, if a Nazir has a glass of wine, that is Usher. He has transgressed something, but that would not require him to restart his Neder Nazirus. It's only Tumah, exposure to Tumah, that requires him to restart. That's why, again, Rashi brings down Tumah, but the truth is it's not really the case. So over here, he's drinking, right? So he decides to go ahead and start drinking. He drinks for a couple of days. And then what ends up happening? Then he petitions the Chacham to be released. It turns out that then the Chacham says no. So I will say, so what's the halacha? Mona misha shenadar. So I will say, what this sounds like over here is, what the Mishnah is saying is, he counts his Neder Nazirus from when? From the time that he made the vow. In other words, that the count continues. So for argument's sake, he made a Neder Nazirus on Rosh Chodesh Adar, and then he goes ahead and what? So let's say on Gimel Adar, he drinks wine for 3 days. He goes to the Chacham a week later, wants to be released. So Chacham says no. So we'll say, what's the duration of his Neder Nazirus? Rosh Chodesh Adar to Rosh Chodesh Nisan. In other words, the count continues. Nishal the Chacham ve'tiro. So we'll say that's case 1. Now, by the way, if you take a look, fine. Yeah, take a look at Rashi just a moment. Mona Naziruso Mishash Adar Kilomar Osin Yamim Shilzilzal ben Naziruso. The days, I will say that the days in which he was mezalzel, the days in which literally again he disparaged his Nazirus, meaning the days that he violated the Nazirus. The Rashi says over here. Ola leminyan shloshim im osan shenishtayru lo misha asru veinsarach limnos iser beminyan ayam shezozl ben Naziruso ela olin lo lashnamas Nazir. So Rabbi say the interesting halacha that the Mishnah is teaching me is that even the days that he violated his Neder Nazirus count towards the tally of the Nazirus. So that's the Chiddush over here. even the days in which he was in violation of his Naziris, i.e. the days that he was drinking wine, count towards the final tally of days. Good. Well, we'll clarify that in the Gemara, qualify that in the Gemara. That's case one. Nishra l'chacham ve'tiru. So we'll say case two, same thing. Reuven became a Nazir, but this time he goes to the Chacham to be released from the neder. And what does the Chacham say? Okay, the Chacham releases him. And what happened? The Nazir himself had, right? Reuven had an animal set aside for a karban. What's the halacha? Teitzei v'tira be'eder. So we've seen this already before. So halacha l'maisa, if you have an animal set aside, right, for a particular karban, but then you have your neder annulled. Right? You have your neder annulled. What's the halacha? The hektish status of the animal evaporates, and the animal goes back out and rejoins the rest of the flock. Amru Beisil Beishamai. We actually quoted this before. Beisil says to Beishamai, Iatem modim bozeh shu hektish tovus sheteitze v'tira be'eder. So remember again. So Beisil used this as to Beishamai as a proof against Beishamai, right? Beishamai said hektish b'taos havi hektish. We saw in yesterday's daf, even though we don't paskin that way, halacha l'maisa, we do paskin that way, hashkafa l'maisa. We saw the beautiful Lublina Rav. So Beis Hillel says to Beis Shammai, isn't this a proof that you see from here the fact that after Reuven is released from his neder naziros, that his animal goes back out to pasture? What does that show you? That shows you that hektish b'taos is not hektish. Beis Shammai says, Iya temod, listen to this. Do you not agree with the following case? So I'll say, totally switching gears. B'mishata v'kar l'tishi asiri, ula asiri tishi, ula chadasar asiri, shehu mekudosh. So we'll say, B'shans back to Hillel, Beis Hillel, what about the following case? We'll say, Meiser Behema. What's Meiser Behema? You have a flock of animals. The 10th animal ultimately, again, is considered to be hektish. So we'll say, imagine the following scenario. What happens if halacha l'maisa, you accidentally call the 9th animal 10? Or you call the 11th animal 10? Or you call the 10th animal 9? Or 11 for that matter. So I will say, interesting, what's halacha? What's halacha? All of these animals are consecrated. Right? All these animals are consecrated. So I will say, so Beis Hillel is trying to show Beis Shammai, remember, in case number 2 in the Mishnah, Reuven became a Nazir. During his Naziros, he set aside an animal for his karban. He then goes to the Chacham annuls his neder. What happens to the animal? No hagdish, it's not kodesh, goes right back out and rejoins its chevra in the flock. So Beis Hillel says to Beis Shammai, what do you see from here? That hektish betos lo havi hektish, that a mistaken hektish is not hektish. Beis Shammai says, Beis Hillel, calm down. What do you do about the following case? What about a case of Meiser Behema, where again it's the 10th animal that's kodesh, but the farmer made a mistake, and what did he do? He called number 9 10, or he called number 11 10, or he called number 9, number 10 9 or 11. Then we'll say, what's the halach in all of these cases? The animals are kodesh. So the Gemara says, Amr lahem Beis Hillel Beis Shammai, lo hashevet kidsho. So Beis Hillel says, Beis Shammai, that's not a fair statement. The staff ultimately again has consecrated the animal. I will say, we're going to see what this means. But remember, on a physical level, remember again, I will say, how do you create Meiser Behema? Right? Remember again, they would take the little staff, the little paintbrush, and smear a little bit of red paint on the animal, designating it as the Kodesh animal. So Beis Hillel says essentially to Beis Shammai, the animal has been designated ultimately as Meiser Behema. Uma ilu ta'a v'yaniach es hashevet ala shmini v'ala shnei masar. Shabbos says, Beis Hillel says, let me ask you, if you were to accidentally call the animal number 8, number 10, or you were accidentally call animal number 12, number 10, ultimately, again, Shema Asaklum, did you do anything? Did you accomplish anything? The answer, Rabbi say, is not. We are going to say something incredibly amazing. There is a unique halacha by Meiser Behema that says animal 10 is Kodesh, and animal 9 if it's called 10, or 11 if it's called 10, or 10 if it's misidentified, right, as 9 or 11, it's Kodesh. In other words, the most saying a little bit simpler, there's a special halacha by Meiser Behema that if you mess up with the animal in direct proximity to 10, i.e. either 9 or 11, they can become Kodesh. But it does not apply to what? 8, 12, or anything lower or higher. The Gemara says, "Ela kasav shekidesh hasiri hu kidesh atishi v'esach alasar." So I'll say, Beis Hillel says to Beis Shammai, you're not bringing up a fair point because, as we're going to see, halacha l'maisa, this is a unique halacha by Meiser Behema that says that what? That animals 9 and 11 have the ability to be consecrated like animal 10. Good. So I'll say, let's analyze the Gemara. Let's analyze the Mishnah, Says the Mishnah. Says the Gemara. Mani masnisim. I will say whose opinion is reflected from in the Mishnah. I will say now, specifically, we're going back to case number 1. What was case number 1? Reuben becomes a Nazir. What happens? Reuben has Nazir remorse. As a result, what does he do with his Nazir remorse? He acts out and he goes drinking. Right? And he drinks wine. And let's say again he ends up drinking wine for 3 days. So we'll say, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, those 3 days still count for Reuven's neder nazirus. Right? And again, and essentially, the duration of his nazirus remains unchanged. So we'll say, whose opinion is our Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Yossi v'lo Rabbanan. I will say it's not Rabbi Yossi nor is it Rabbanan. Why not? Here we go. Disanya misha nadava avra al naziruso. If someone went ahead and made a neder nazirus and then was in violation of his nazirus, so we'll say, so again, we're not talking about tumah over here, because remember again, when it comes to tumah, what happens? You have that's a biblical, right? You have to start all over. That's a doraisa, right? You bring your current nazirus to a close. You even offer up karbanos, and you begin all over again. So that's not this case. This is a case of someone who made an neder nazirus and he drank. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ein niskakin lo ela imkein mona bahen isr kiyamim shenahig bahen heter. We'll say, this is incredible. We will not help him. In other words, let's say now he comes along and he says, you know what? I would like to get out of my neder nazirus. So you know what we tell him? We are not having a conversation with you until what? Until you make up the days you messed up. I this is incredible. So in other words, we can have a conversation about getting out of your nazirus, but only when? Only when you first observe the days in which you flagrantly violated your neder nazirus. When you make up those days, we can talk. I will say that's the Rabbanon. Rabbi Yossi says Dayo Shloshim Yom. Rabbi Yossi says, look, it's enough if he has 30 days. It's enough if he has 30 days. So I will say this would be a case, for example, the Rosh points out, let's say Reuven became a Nazir for 100 days. And let's say he went ahead and he drank wine on 40 of them. So the Rabbanon will say, we're not getting involved with you until what? You observe another what? Another 40. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't have to do 40. You don't have to do 40. You just have to what? You just have to go ahead and do 30. In other words, 30 days is the maximum makeup time we're going to make a person do. So Rabbi will say, so what's the problem? Both Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon will say, have the opinion that what? If you flagrantly violate your neder nazirus, right? Let's say, for example, you drink wine. So although the neder nazirus is intact, and now you come to a chacham to try to get released from the neder, what's the halacha? We're not talking to you until when? Till you make up the days that you violated your nazirus. Now, there's a machlokes. How much do you have to make up? According to the Rabbanon, you have to make up the exact number of days in which you violated. Rabbi Yossi, we're going to cap it at 30. Cap it at 30, says the Gemara. So we'll say, so we're trying to figure out whose opinion does our Mishnah affect. We'll say, because what does our Mishnah say? If Reuven became a Nazir, he violated his neder nazirus. So we'll say, what do we do with him? What is according to the Mishnah? What do you do with him? According to the Mishnah, nothing. Right? The Mishnah just makes it sound like he just continues to count his neder nazirus, that we're not doing anything. So we'll say, what's going on? So who does the Mishnah reflect? I Rabbanon, kash nazirus mu'ates. So we'll say, if it's the Rabbanon, ultimately, again, the kasha is on a smaller, a 30-day nazirus. Because we won't say, it doesn't sound like from the Mishnah he has to make up anything. Rabbi Yossi kasha nazirus ruba. And if it's Rabbi Yossi, it will be a question on a longer nazirus. Because according to Rabbi Yossi, on a longer nazirus, even if you violated more than 30 days, you're capped at 30. So we'll say, so how do you reconcile these two opinions with the Mishnah? Rabbi Yossi. No, the Mishnah could reflect both views. Rabbi Yossi, Kahn benezirus meruba, Kahn benezirus mu'ates. They will say it's possible, ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Yossi, that ultimately, again, the Mishnah is talking about is talking about ultimately a longer Nazirus, and the Bracha is talking about ultimately a smaller Nazirus. V'bay Seim Rabbanon lo tema misha shenazar ela kimisha shenazar. And according to Rabbanon, ultimately again, don't say it's from the time that from the time that he took the Nazirus, rather like from the time that he took the Nazirus, i.e., did he have to repeat the amount of time that he actually violated. So therefore, I will say, what the Gemara wants to suggest is that the Mishnah indeed accepts this principle. What's the principle? That when you violate your Nazirus, I will say, what do you have to do? You have to make up the time. You have to make up the time. Now there's a machlokes. How much time do you have to make up? According to the Rabbanon, you have to make up the full time that you violated. According to Rabbi Yossi, you only have to make up to 30 days of violation. So Rabbi say this is really quite fascinating. So how do we paskin? So the Rambam says as follows. The Rambam says, this is in Parak Dalid Halacha Yud Gimel. Mi shenadar ben Nazir. So Rabbi say the way the Rambam frames this case is that halacha l'maaseh guy became a Nazir. The dima she'eno neder v'hayanoik heter benidro v'shasa yain. And in his mind, the neder shouldn't be binding, and therefore he was drinking wine. Right? So remember again, this was the guy who felt. So the way the Rambam frames the case is that Reuven became a Nazir, and then Reuven in his own mind felt that he shouldn't be bound by this neder. So what does he do? He starts drinking wine. Then afterwards he goes to a chacham to go ahead and get released. And what does the chacham say to him? No, you're bound. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Hare ze mona mishash Adar. And we'll say, look what the Rambam does. Mida oraisa, we'll say. Mida oraisa, as long as you are not metame lemesim, what happens with the clock on your neder nazirus? Mida oraisa, it keeps running. So drinking during Nazirus will not stop the clock, will not require you to start over. All drinking does is you're in violation. As you've committed an Avera, but the clock continues. Now watch the Rambam. So umidivrei sofrim sheyinog iser kiyamim shenag bahen heter. The Rambam says midrabanon. How do we paskin? Midrabanon we say you have to reobserve. You have to make up the days. You have to make up the days that you violated. So we'll say, how many days? Like the Rabbanon, as many days as you violated. So we'll say, so this is the halacha l'maisa. So mida araisa, as long as you're not becoming tamei, ultimately again, the clock on your neder nazirus does not stop because of violation. It keeps going. Midrabanon, we say, you have to make up the days in which you violated. So therefore, again, Reuven drank for 40 days. He's got to go ahead and make up 40 days of that nazirus. Midrabanon. Quite fascinating. I will say, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Nisha Achacham v'tirua. So let's remember again, case number two was Reuven became a Nazir. Remember again, after he became a Nazir, what did he do? He set aside his carbon. Right? He set aside his carbon. Then he goes to the Chacham. He's released from the neder. So I will say, what's the halacha? What do you do with the carbon? It goes back out to pasture. Alright? So Beis Hillel will say this is a case of hektish betos, and hektish betos is not hektish. Not hektish. So it says the Gemara, Amar B'Yirmiyah midibei Shammai, Amar B'Yirmiyah midibei Shammai nishma l'debeis Hillel, lav Amri Beis Shammai hektish betos have a hektish. So I will say, from Beis Shammai's statement, and from Beis Hillel's subsequent statement back to Beis Shammai, it sounds that what? That Beis Shammai holds, hektish betos is have a hektish. I will say again, and this goes back to yesterday's circuit. We kind of already established this in Beis Shammai, that Beis Shammai holds this way. To which the Gemara says, Kevan diglai milsa, the lav shapir nazir, teitse v'tira be'eder. Therefore, we'll say, since it turns out that in fact what? That in fact, Reuven's neder nazirus was not a real neder. In other words, it was annulled. Therefore, what? Therefore, the animal could go back out to pasture. To which the Gemara says, so V'lav Shapir Nazir, Teisei V'tira Be'eder, L'Beis Hillel Nami, Afal Gav Da Amri Tmura B'Tos Havyi Tmura. Remember again, we saw this in yesterday's daf, right? Beis Hillel holds that what? Beis Hillel holds that Tmura B'Tos. Remember again this case from yesterday? What's Tmura B'Tos? Tmura B'Tos is a case of, I have in mind to swap out my Ola for another Olah. But instead I end up doing it for Shlomim. That's the case of Temura B'Tos. And I'm going to say, ultimately, again, Temura B'Tos, everyone agrees what? Works. Hani mili, heicha di'isei le'ikar hektish. Now I'm going to say, why does Temura B'Tos work? Because ultimately, the original source of the Kiddusha is still intact. Aval hacha, demis aker ikar hektish, is aker nami Temura. So I just want to point out, Beis Hillel makes a very interesting distinction over here. Even in general, if you want to hold hektish b'taos works, I will say when does hektish b'taos work? When the source Kiddusha is intact. But if the source Kiddusha is no longer intact, then subsequent Kiddusha built on it should not work. So I will say, what's a good example of where original Kiddusha is no longer intact? The case of the Mishnah. Reuven becomes a Nazir, designates an animal ultimately as a karban. I will say, and then what happens? He has hataras nadarim. Right? The Chacham is matir his neder. I will say, what happens when the Chacham is matir his neder? What happens? There's no neder nazirus. What happens when there's no neder nazirus? What happens? There's no karban nazirus, which means that the original Kiddusha itself no longer exists. So we'll say, basically, I'll just make an interesting point over here, that the reason why Temura B'Taos could work is why? Because the original Kiddusha of the source animal is still intact. Over here, there is no original Kiddusha that is intact. Okay? So we'll say, again, we saw this in yesterday's daf. We already know that. How do we paskin? We paskin hektish b'taos, lav hektish, which is why we pass like this Mishnah. Now, this is not really a case of hektish b'taos, but halacha l'maisa, the way we pass it is like the Mishnah here, namely, that when the Nazir set aside an animal for his karban, and then ultimately was released from his neder naziros, that animal has no Kiddusha, and it simply goes back out and joins the rest of the herd. Good, let's go back there. Itmar, so we'll say now, I'm sorry, Aramar, Iyat modim shilu kar l'chiyas here. And we'll say, so now let's go back for just a second and talk about Meiser Behema, because this is really a very interesting case. So what did we see from the Mishnah? So leaving aside the whole dialogue between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, right? But remember again, let's get to the halacha Meiser Behema. Halacha Meiser Behema is the 10th animal is Kodesh. 10th animal is Kodesh. An interesting halacha that says, if you accidentally call the 9th the 10th, or the 11th the 10th, then what I will say? They're Kodesh. They're Kodesh. Which I will say means, I just want to point out, if you're really distracted, and you call number 9, 10, number 10, 10, and number 11, 10, guess what? You have 3 animals that are Kodesh. 3 animals that are Kodesh. Not only that, I will say, but number 10 is also de facto Kodesh, which means that even if you call number 10, number 9, or number 11, it's still Kodesh as well. Right? So I will say, but this only applies to the animals before and after 10. So in other words, the only animals this can impact are animals 9, 10, 11. 8 and below, if you mess up, it doesn't matter. 12 and above, if you mess up, it doesn't matter. So let's see this inside. Says Yimar Itmar, Meiser, Rav Nachman Amar Ta'uso v'lo Kavanaso. Shabbos is very interesting. When it comes to Meiser Behema, Shabbos say the only time that ultimately, again, a mistaken designation could take effect is only that, if it's a mistake, but not kavanah. We'll say, if you look at the rush for just a moment, in the wide lines, the rush is the bottom left-hand side of the page. If you look in the wide lines, 5 lines in, ta'uso v'lo kavanah. So, imhaya yodea shaya tishi'i v'kara asiri l'kodesh. They will say, watch this. What happens if you purposely call number 9, 10? You purposely did it. So Rav Nachman says, 9 does not become Kodesh. The only time that 9 becomes Kodesh is when I will say, Tos, if it's a mistake. Right? So, and we'll see, it's based on the Xeris, so only if it's a mistake. But if you intentionally call 9, 10, or for that matter, you intentionally call 11, 10, that does not make it Kodesh. Rav Chisda, Rav Huna, Amri, Ta'uso, the Choshkin Kavanaso. Rav Chisda, Rav Huna say, no. So, mistake, and certainly B'Kavana. In other words, we'll say, if a mistaken designation works to make 9, 10, or 11, 10, certainly what? Kavana, certainly an intentional misdesignation will also go ahead and make it Kodesh. So Rava said to Rav Nachman, Lidi dach to amrit ta'uso v'lo kavanaso. So according to Rav Nachman, who holds that halacha l'maisa, it's only a mistaken designation that gives 9 kedusha, but an intentional one will not. So ultimately, again, the ka'amri beis Shammai lebeis Hillel, that which beis Shammai said to beis Hillel in the Mishnah, iya temodim shilu kar l'tishi asiri ula asiri tishi ula achadasar asiri sheshloshtan mikudashin. So remember again, beis Shammai said to beis Hillel, don't you agree? Remember again, Beis Shammai was trying to make a point about hektish betos. Right? So Beis Shammai says to Beis Hillel, don't you agree that if you call 9, 10, 10, 10, and 11, 10, that all 3 of them are kodesh? Vishtiku Beis Hillel, and Beis Hillel was quiet. Why didn't Beis Hillel say Leimru lahon malamaiser shekin aino kadosh bekavana? Right? Remember again, I both say Beis Shammai shoots this back at Beis Hillel in an effort to what? To show Beis Hillel that in fact hektish betos works. Why can't Beis Hillel fire back and say what? No, Beis Shammai, that's not a good raya, because the raya is this only works when betos. This only works if it's a mistake. It will not work bekavana. Leimur lahon malamaiser shekin eno kadosh bekavana. I will say, so why didn't Beis Hillel say that back? Rav Simi bar Ashi hainu taima delo amri lahon. The reason why Beis Hillel didn't say this is because the kavachomer. It's kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma meiser she'enu kadosh bekavana kadosh betos. So say hektish. Meiser behema, which a mistaken designation, if done intentionally, does not work, but if done mistakenly, does. So hektish shekadosh bekavana. They say regular hektish, which does become kadosh bekavana. Lo kol shekain, all the more so. V'lohi, and I will say this is not a good kavachomer. Why? The hektish b'daito dimarei tali. Because ultimately, again, I will say, in general, hektish is dependent on the kavana, the mindset, or the kavana of the person who was consecrating. Fine. So I will say that's why Beis Hillel did not make the rejoinder. I will say, but how do we paskin halacha l'maisa? So I will say, so first of all, number one, the way we paskin is hektish b'taos lav hektish. We saw that in yesterday's daf. Number two, I will say, we paskin when it comes to meiser behema that a mistaken designation of 9 as 10 or as 11 as 10 ultimately works. Or when I say works is, it's kodesh. It's kodesh. So I will say, so again, it's such a good musar to not being distracted, right? Whenever you're distracted in life, you make mistakes. So I will say, so you can end up in a situation of having 3 animals designated as meiser behema. You could have 9, 10, and 11. When could that happen? It's good Shabbos table trivia. When can you have 3 animals as meiser behema? If you're distracted and you call 9, 10, 10, 10, and 11, 10. Now the truth is when it comes to number 10, 10 is Kodesh. We'll say even if what? Doesn't matter what you call it. Right? 10 is Kodesh because animal number 10 has de facto Kedusha. De facto Kedusha. So even if you call number 10 number 2, it doesn't make any difference. 10 has de facto Kedusha. Which I will say, if you think about it, by the way, well, okay, we'll go on in just a moment. And I will say, the Rambam Paskin is like Rav Chisda, that halacha l'maisa, whether you're making these mistaken designations accidentally or intentionally, halacha l'maisa, the kedusha is binding. So I will say, I'll just mention that those are the 3 halachas. I'll just mention, I will say, if you think about it, by the way, in this case, there are 2 different levels of kedusha that exist in this world. There's innate kedusha, de facto kedusha, and there is earned kedusha. Right? So if you think about it, I will say, in animal number 10 has innate de facto kedusha. In other words, the fact that animal exits as number 10, that's kaddish. That's kaddish. You call it 10, you call it 2, you call it Harry, whatever you want to call it, right? L'maisa, at the end of the day, that animal is kaddish. That is innate kedusha. Versus, I will say, if you call number 9, 10, or 11, 10, suddenly you make those animals kaddish as well. And I will say, it's an incredible metaphor for us as well. We possess innate kedusha. Where does that kedusha come from? That comes from the truth is that comes from previous generations, right? That comes from the fact that I'm a child of the avos and the imos. I'm a member of Klal Yisrael. That is my kedusha. I didn't do anything to earn it, right? I didn't do anything to acquire it. It was just conferred upon me. And I will say, but it's not enough to go through life with that kedusha. You also have to acquire what? Earned kedusha. Earned kedusha, I will say, is the kedusha you create for yourself. Your innate kedusha is the kedusha Kadosh Baruch Hu gives to me. Your earned kedusha ultimately. So like the Meister Behema, I'm also I'm a 10. I'll say good news. Someone told you you're a 10, right? You're a 10, right? So ultimately, again, you are a 10. Each of us is a 10. But lamaisa, that's the conferred kedusha. But lamaisa, now I also have to earn my kedusha. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. One of my favorite ideas, the Belzer Rebbe says, as Yashir, we said this part of the Shah, Zekili va'anveyu elokei avi va'aromemenu. Right, this is my God, Zekili va'anveyu, and I'll make him great. Elokei avi va'aromemenu, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Belzer Rebbe says there are two different relationships with Hashem. There's Elokei avi, there's the God of your father. Right, there's the spirituality you have from your parents. Right, that which was instilled within you. That's Elokei avi. But it's not enough just to go through life with the God of your father. You also have to create for yourself Zekeli, my God. My God. It's not enough to go through what's been given to you from previous generations. You have to create your own relationship as well. It's not enough just to be a 10. It's not enough just to go ahead and go through life with your innate Kedusha. You have to acquire Kedusha as well. You have to create something beautiful for yourself as well. Incredible. Mishnah. Misha Nadar ben Nazir v'halach lahavias behemto umasa shenignava. Rabbi said this is an incredible case. Ruvain became a Nazir. Ruvain became a Nazir. Now there's a little bit, now it's important to understand that there's a little bit of subtext to this. Ruvain became a Nazir. At the time that Ruvain became a Nazir, he knew that he had an animal, right, for his karban. And he became a Nazir with the mindset that he's going to use that particular animal for his karban. Okay, what happens? He now goes to retrieve the karban, and it turns out, umasa shenignava. And I will say, it turns out that what? The animal is son. I will say, if you look at the Rush says the verse, second to last line, Misha Nadar ben Nazir, ubishar shenadar hayulo behemos, vadaita dahachi nadar sheyakriv karbanos amelsamemes. So I will say, let's say for example, right, Reuven becomes a Nazir, and at the time of his neder, he has 3 animals. He says, okay, perfect. One for a chatas, one for an ola, one for a shlama. Beautiful. After he takes an neder naziros, he then goes to the pen, and what does he realize? They've been stolen. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, so now, if you're Ruvain, right, what do you want at this point? What do you want? You want out of your neder naziros. Now we'll say, the Rush says over here, it's the last line on the page, V'halach lahavi behemto v'nignava umachmas zu mischarit al naziruso. Now we'll say, now as a result, Ruvain has charata. Because he's like, look, I only became a Nazir because I figured, all right, I have it financially covered. Right? I have my karbanos. Now, I don't have it financially covered, and I regret having become a Nazir. So I'll say, so now what's the halach over here? This is incredible. So says the Mishnah, Im ad shelo nignava behemto Nazir, harei Nazir. I will say, if at the time that Reuven became a Nazir, he still had the animals, namely, the animals were stolen after the neder naziros, then what Rabbi say? Reuven's a Nazir. Since at the time that he made the neder, the animals were there, therefore halacha l'maisa, his neder is absolutely valid. Right? Rashi says over here, before we turn the page, Rashi says over here, Imachlo nignava behema, afapi sha'achshav nignava, ubalif nechacham l'ftoach lo v'lomar ilo ayisi yodeh shetikna behemtecha, mi ayisi nozer, v'amar lav, harizen nozer she'ein poschen la'adab benolad. We'll say, here it is. Now watch this. So we'll say, so let's just play this out. Right? Reuven becomes a Nazir. Right? Why does Reuven become a Nazir? Why? Well, we don't know exactly why he's becoming a Nazir, but here's what I do know. Is that part of his motivation is he's got the financial side of this covered. Right? He's got the 3 animals, he's good to go. He goes to check on his karbanos, stolen. He comes to the Chacham and he says, listen, I regret ever having become a Nazir. Chacham says why? And he says ultimately because my animals were stolen. So Rabbi say, so first order of business is what do we have to figure out? When were they stolen? The Rabbi says, so the first thing the Mishnah says is, if they were stolen after the time of the neder, then ultimately the neder stands. Why Rabbi say, back to our nedarim days, ein poschen benolad. Rabbi say, what does ein poschen benolad mean? In order for a Pesach to be effective, the circumstances had to have been present at the time the neder was made. We do not create a Pesach for annulment based on new circumstances. Based on the circumstances that were not in existence at the time the neder were made. Ein poskim benolad. We're going to see that actually it's even a little bit more than that. In this case over here, is ein poskim benolad also means we do not create an opening for neder annulment with new circumstances that even had they been brought to the attention of the person at the time he made the neder, he probably would have still vowed anyway. So let me illustrate this in just a moment. At the time that Reuven was making the neder, so I will say, if somebody would have said to Reuven, tell me, if your animals would be stolen, would you still be willing to make this neder? So I will say, the Mishnah is making the assumption that what would Reuven have said? What would he have said? Yes. Why? Why I will say? Because the notion of Reuven's sheep or his animals being stolen is so far-fetched. He clearly doesn't live in Baltimore, right? So I'll say, so again, so Lamaisa, the notion of his livestock being taken is so far-fetched that it wouldn't steer his decision-making. So therefore, Allah will say, in poschem benolad. Conversely, Amar Bezer will say, v'im mishenignyava behem to Nazir. But on the other hand, if halacha l'maisa will say, it turns out that what? That the animals were in fact already stolen at the time he made his neder naziros, then what? Then ultimately, again, Eino Nazir, Eino Nazir. Shabbos say, remember, if at the time he made the neder naziros, the animals were already stolen, then Shabbos say, he's not a Nazir. Why? Because that's called a naziros b'tos. Shabbos say, since it's clear that he was undertaking the neder naziros, right, with a certain mindset, which was, I have animals to cover my obligation, if at the time that he actually became a Nazir, the animals were already stolen, that is a Nazir b'tos. And I will say, take a look at the first Rashi on Lamed Beis and Beis. He writes, Mishenigdava behemto Nazir, shebedaito hayel lekabel nazirus al osa be'ema, ubishasha Nazir lahaisa birshuso, harezo eino Nazir dinazirus b'tos havi. So I will say, isn't this fascinating? So two different cases here. Right, so case number one, right, all the same thing. Reuven's becoming a Nazir, and it's clear that Reuven's motivation, I shouldn't say it's his motivation, but part of his cheshbon with becoming a Nazir is that what? He has the animals to cover his sacrificial obligations. After he becomes a Nazir, he goes to check on the animals, they're stolen. He comes to the Chacham, he wants out. I regret ever having become a Nazir now that my animals were stolen. So we'll say, what's that halacha? It depends. If at the time that he made the neder naziros, the animals were still in his possession, then we do not let out the neder naziros. Why not? Because that's nolad, new circumstances, in poschem and nolad. If, however, the animals were already stolen at the time he undertook his neder naziros, then what? We let him out because that isn't a zirus b'tos. The whole thing is a mistake in a zirus. Now, now watch this. This is an incredible Gemara. Incredible Mishnah. V'zu tos ta'a nachum hamadi ki sha'alu nazira min agola. Now, we'll say, get ready for this. This mistake, by the way, was made by Nachum Hamadi. I will say, who was Nachum Hamadi? He was a great Talmud Chacham. That what happened was, there were Nazirim who came up from the diaspora, Umatsu Beis Hamikdash Charav. I will say, they found, this Rashi points out, this is the Second Temple era. So I will say, listen to this story. There are a group of Nazirim who came from the diaspora. Why did they come? They came to the Beis Hamikdash in order to offer up their karbanos. I will say, they show up at the Beis HaMikdash, and what do they see? It's been destroyed. I will say, can you imagine that? You see, for us, the fact that the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, okay, it's been seared into our consciousness for 2,000 years. Imagine being a Yid like that, where you're coming to the Beis HaMikdash to offer up your karbanos, you show up and you see that your beautiful Beis HaMikdash has been destroyed. So Nachamadi said to them, Ilu hayisem yodin shebeis HaMikdash charav, hayisem nozrim. So I will say, so Nachamadi said to them, he said, tell me, had you known that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, would you have become a Nazir? Amru lo. They said to him, of course not. V'tiron Nacham Hamadi. And Nacham Hamadi permitted them based on this ma'aser. I will say, now remember again, what do Nacham Hamadi do? This is nolad. Right? This is new circumstances that came to light, and ultimately Nacham Hamadi allowed them to be released from their neder because of nolad. But when the matter came before the Chachamim, Amru, Kol Shen Nazir Ad Shelochara Beis HaMikdash Nazir, or Mishachara Beis HaMikdash Eino Nazir. When this became before Nachum Hamadi, so ultimately again, when this came before the Rabban said, Nachum Hamadi, you're wrong. If at the time they made the Neder Nazirus, ultimately what? The Beis HaMikdash was standing, then Halacha L'Maisa, it's a valid karban. Because otherwise that would be Posachim and Nolad. If on the other hand, at the time they made the Neder, the Beis HaMikdash was already destroyed, then Einachinami, it's not a Nazirus. Why? That's Nazirus Betos. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba, Shetafu Rabbanan Rabbi Eliezer, V'okmin B'shita Sayu. We'll say ultimately again, the Rabbanan overtook Rabbi Eliezer, and ultimately again won him over to their side. I will say, Rabbi Eliezer is the opinion that says Poschin Benolad. Right? He allows you to create a Pesach for Neder annulment, even with new information that did not exist at the time of the Neder. But I will say, the Gemara is suggesting now that Rabbi Eliezer ultimately again went over to the side of the Rabbanon and said that Nolad doesn't work. This nan, because we learned Poschin Benolad, you could create a Pesach with Rabbi Eliezer, V'cham Decham Osun, the Chum say you cannot. V'amarava af agav d'amar Rabbanan ein Poschin Benolad, ava Poschin B'tinai Nolad. So what's very interesting, the Rabbanan said, even though we say that you cannot go ahead and open up with Nolad, what can you do? You can go ahead and open with Tinai Nolad. And I will say, what's Tinai Nolad? So I'll say, if you take a look, actually, let's first read the Gemara. Listen to this. Hey Chidami, what's the case of Tinai Nolad? So the Gemara says, Amri Lahon, Ilu Ase Inish, Va'amr Lachon, Decharav Beis HaMikdash, Mi Hava Nidrisun. Shabbos said, listen to this. So we say to the person who made the vow, if at the time you made the neder, if your friends would have come to you and would tell you, you know that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, or say a little bit differently, that the Beis HaMikdash could be destroyed, and if the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed, would you go ahead and make this neder? And I will say, watch what's happening over here. You see, the case of Nolad says like this, that even Nolad says new circumstances come, and we're confident that even if what? Even had the person known about those or even had the person been told about the potential for those circumstances at the time he made the neder, he still would have what? Still would have made the neder, because they're so far-fetched. But I will say, sometimes it's different when your friends come and tell you something, right? When your friends come and tell you something, you heed it a little bit more. Shabbos said, now watch this. So Nolad means like this. Nolad means, so let's play this out. Right? Reuven becomes a Nazir. Right? And then what happens? The Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. And Reuven says, had I known the Beis HaMikdash would have been destroyed, I would have never gone ahead and made the neder. That's called Nolad, and we would not release him based on that. Why, Rabbi say? Now what's the logic? Because we assume that even at the time of the neder, if somebody would have said, Reuven, would you still do this if the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed? Reuven would have said, yes. Why? Because the notion that the Beis HaMikdash would be destroyed is so far-fetched that he would have made the neder anyway. But we'll say, Tanai Nolad says like this, that what if Reuven's friends would have gotten around him, Reuven's friends would have said, Reuven, there's a possibility the Beis HaMikdash should be destroyed. Would you still make the neder? So I will say, when you have your chevra trying to convince you of something, often, that's much more compelling. That's called Tanai Nolad. So Tanai Nolad works. Tanai Nolad, if you take a look at the Rush is over here, it's the last couple of short lines in the Rush. Ava poschim Tanai Nolad, the Amri Lahu, Ilu asu inchi the Amri Luchu the Chara Beis HaMikdash Miyavin Dira. So Ilu hayu ba'in anashim vayu nosnin lahem eitza shelo tiduru ilu so iulai yachrav Beis HaMikdash tam klos niziruchem klum hayisim nodrim va'amru came hayinu nimlachim v'shom la'atzasam. Shabbos say, so this is very interesting. So this is going to be tonight. Actually what we're going to do is we're going to stop over here for today. As you can see, tomorrow's daf is quite short. So we have a little bit of time in Meretz Hashem to be able to get through the rest of this. So we'll say. So what I want to point out over here, let's stop because I want to share with you a vart on the parasha. So again, let's just understand where we're stopping. Where we're stopping right now is everyone is agreeing ein poschin benolad. That's what everyone is agreeing on. It seems to be in Abosai, but there's another concept. What's the other concept? Tanai Nolad. And Tanai Nolad seems to be, what's the difference between Nolad and Tanai Nolad? Tanai Nolad has a chevra component in it, right? There's a social piece in it. Maybe Tanai Nolad will work, and Mr. will say we'll pick up with that tomorrow. So let me just share with you a short, very